what you need to be good at to finish your PhD are not the same things that you need to be good at if you want to run a company. People who are adaptable, flexible, and then quick and can change the way they think about things, and can move into some CEO role and so on, right? And in some cases, it's actually much better for everybody involved that company founder maybe becomes more like this CSO, right? And not involved in the business side, because that requires a different set of skills, right?
How often do you think the student themselves gets that? Like that they're self-aware enough that, oh, I shouldn't, I should be CEO, I should be CSO, or vice versa?
There are people who have had many more students going to startups than me that will be better able to answer that question.
Well, Klavs, thanks a lot for joining. And it sounds like it's your first time having Boba. What's the verdict so far?
It's fine.
It's fine.
Well, thank you.
What are our critiques? Because you got the green tea with like mango and bubbles in it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's fun.
Right,
it's a little sweet.
We'll improve on that next time. People need their sugar rush. So, Debbie, thanks for joining. If you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of background on yourself. I mean, you've been a professor at MIT for a long time, but just a little bit of background on how you got there, so we have context as we go through the other questions.
I started my career as an academician at University of Minnesota, which was a wonderful department. And I was actually quite happy there. I originally had got my PhD in catalysis and reaction engineering. And thanks to one of my colleagues, actually, who said, have you ever looked at chemical vapor deposition? And I started looking at it and started working with people at AT&T Bell Laboratories and IBM, and really got interested in how to help the microelectronics industry understand the processes that we're using. And, we've sort of gone full circle. We're back to actually this stuff being kind of interest again.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so, MIT thought they really could use people that had that kind of knowledge of how to work with understanding industrial processes and coming up with new approaches to solving important problems in terms of modern technology. And so I got hired. So for a number of years, worked in electronics processing, all the technologies around that, materials in general. Was interested in chips, and since we knew so much about silicon manufacturing, got together with Marty Schmidt, who was a MEMS manufacturer, and started thinking about, well, what could you actually use MEMS technology to besides the obvious things like accelerometers and so on. Did it make any sense in chemical or biological applications? And this was also at the time when there was a lot of interest in micrototal analysis beginning to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got into the field of micrototal analysis and really with the idea of what could you actually do beyond analysis with these tools.
Yeah.
And that sort of led to then making chemicals on a chip. And then you ask yourself, why would you make small amounts of chemicals, right? And where would you make small amounts of chemicals? And then in the biology space, we started by thinking about, well, what could you do with cells on a chip that made sense to do? Like things like separating out mitochondria. And ultimately that led to the project of, could you actually inject stuff into cells at a very high rate? That obviously was a barrier for many, many things if you could get things across the cell membranes. And that's sort of where you came into the picture.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. And so at a time when we had figured out how to do it with a single needle and getting the cells stuck on the needle, and had come up with a very complicated system to try and shoot stuff into a cell.
Yeah.
But also this work that we had was making things on chips and making things in small amounts were obviously important to the pharmaceutical industry because it allowed you to screen large amount of chemicals quickly. But also was sort of a continuation at a very small scale of classical chemical engineering in terms of flow chemists doing things in continuous processing. And so when you ask yourself, well, that's okay, but instead of doing things at the billion tons, a million tons, what if you only had to do a ton or less a year? Could you think about how to do that? And that sort of led to our interest in flow chemistry and working with the pharmaceutical industry of modernizing pharmaceutical manufacturing.
You were head of the chemical engineering department at some points. I guess one thing just for level setting with the audience I'm curious about is like, what made you want to stay on the academic side versus, let's say, going into industry at some point?
Well,
and dealing with, unruly students like me throughout your career.
Well, actually, dealing with the students was probably the thing that kept me in there because that was really the most fun part of it. Mm-hmm. But when I first started out, I used to tell my wife, if I don't get tenure, it's not such a problem because I can quit and double my salary and half my hours. And so, but I think what really kept me in working was really the interaction with the students and the ability to pick up new problems, learn new things, and continually learn all the time. Of course, you can do that in industry too.
Yeah.
But I sort of felt like I'm very happy to do this with learning alongside my students who were my best teachers.
I guess with that motivation of both the students and the new technologies, what's your view of kind of the evolution of these technologies where like, what are the phases where it's ideal they stay academic? What are the phases at which they should go into some kind of startup versus they should just go straight to a big company? And what technologies should die because they're cute but otherwise useless. And I know it's a broad question, but just kind of you come at it from a very different perspective than some others would because you're often observing the origination of them when others won't see it till much later.
I think there's sort of a lot of people, I think, generally agrees upon some of these things, right? So there are certain projects, maybe purely of academic interest. It's sort of like, how does this work, sort of? But they don't solve a need. So it's going to be very hard to justify how are you going to actually make someone interested in making a product out of this that you can sell, right? Project that are still very early on, where if you started a company, the company would essentially become a research organization, trying to figure out how to actually get this to work.
Yeah.
And that's probably too early, right?
Yeah.
So somewhere in between those two extremes is sort of where the best opportunities lie. You've got to think about too, for instance, something general that people can apply, like, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, the sort of continuous processing. There's certainly opportunities for people building equipment for them.
Yeah.
But it's hard to build, a major company doing that. And, it was a service company, right? But it's such a fragmented that they're big pharma companies, right? But then there are also all the small CMOs, the contract manufacturing organizations, right? They really don't have the ability to use these things.
Yep.
So, and then there's the other thing with something like this is that since it's a technology that replaces an existing technology, you have to get around the accountants, right? Because you go to the boss and say, we'd like to put in this new technology. It says, yeah, well, we have all this other stuff that we have capital invested in.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost us a fortune to rip one out and put the other one in. And how are we ever going to recruit that? And so in that case, it becomes very difficult. And that's why, for instance, this technology that was supposed to be a real aid to European and American chemical manufacturing is doing fabulously in China.
Yeah. Because
they're all starting with new factories. There's nothing in them. So they can start with the modern technology first, rather than having to think about, well, if I put that new technology in, what do I do with all my old batch reactors?
It's an interesting way to think about that if the new technology is highly differentiated, then even people with a lot of vested interest in the old school stuff will probably find a way to make it work. But if it's a more meaningful but still incremental improvement, it's only going to go into the next factory. It's never going to replace the old one. That's right. And does that mean that normally you've observed the more still meaningful but incremental improvements become very hard to spin out or get going in a quick manner, but the massive differentiators are the ones that have a chance?
Right.
Okay. And I guess as you think about, I'm sure you've seen many flavors of this in your lab or other labs where people come up with cool new things. And some of them spin out, some of them don't, some of them just die on a shelf. I mean, they may have had a great paper at some point, but nothing happened past that paper. What do you think is, let's say at the lab level, the difference between the labs that do spin out a lot of things versus the ones that don't? Like what in your view tended to define those differences?
Well, I think that tend to be labs that are very entrepreneurial.
And is that a culture difference or a structure difference or?
I think it's a cultural difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of self-reinforces.
Mm-hmm.
So students that come in and really want to start their own company would tend to gravitate towards those laboratories.
Yeah.
And then there are laboratories that are really set to give people a very strong foundation in the sciences. And the idea is that you go out and start your own academic group, but maybe you'll go work for a company.
And whether it's in your lab or other people's labs, let's say when you see two technologies that you think both of them have a great shot at making a difference, but one of them ends up being a successful spin out, the other one ends up not being successful. What do you feel like is the most common difference between them as far as what happened?
I haven't spent enough time looking at that. If I could tell you that, I could probably be very good.
What do you think? It's often a technical thing or a people thing or?
A multitude of things, right? It's people, timing, funding, so on.
Mm-hmm.
Timing is often really critical too, right? You happen to move something out that shows up to be a really revolutionary thing that everybody is interested in.
Oh, like the broader macro cycle of people's interest in this space enables that.
And so there's more money available to you to invest, right? You have to have a great thing, but the market is going down and nobody wants to invest, right?
Do you think that's a more dominant phenomenon than, let's say, the people involved with it?
No, I think
it's okay if yes.
You have to have both, I think. You have to have the right people to enjoy it. Like you have to have someone who has the vision and the ideas to drive it forward.
And when
actually you have to have a team that have that, because it's very seldom to find individuals that have that, right?
Yeah, that's true. And when you think about, let's say, the PhD students or postdocs that are chaperoning these technologies through, are there characteristics of them that you've observed? Like, okay, these are the ones that are more likely to make it. These are the ones that probably shouldn't have done the startup.
No, I don't think I've ever been able to. I think if you were able to predict that, there are a lot of people that would like to talk to you.
Or I guess maybe then flipping it, what do you think is the hardest things to tell? Like, in hindsight, it becomes clear, but it's so hard to tell in advance. Like, what are the things they need to be good at that it's really hard to tell at the time?
Well, as you know from your own experience, what you need to be good at to finish your PhD are not the same things that you need to be good at if you want to run a company.
Yeah.
Right? And so the people who are adaptable, flexible, and then quick, and can change the way they think about things, and can move into some CEO role and so on, right? And in some cases, it's actually much better for everybody involved that the company founder maybe becomes more like this CSO, right? And not involved in the business side, because that requires a different set of skills, right?
How often do you think the student themselves gets that? Like that they're self-aware enough that, I shouldn't. I should be CEO, I should be CSO, or vice versa.
There are people who have had many more students going to startups than me that would be better able to answer that question.
What do you think are the best ways to tell if a technology is ready for going out there versus it should wait and incubate more on the academic side?
I think getting feedback from potential investors, customers, does this really address the need? Is it something that can grow to sort of get an evaluation of what is really the potential of it?
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, that's where places like MIT have an advantage, because we have such a large number of alumni that have gone out and started businesses and are willing to re-engage and talk with students and provide, right? So the Desponder Center at MIT, for instance, had, I think, a very nice sort of series of grants where they had catalysts from investor communities interacting with people on the grants to try and help them go to the next piece from, the wonderful paper to actually something that might be an idea that could be commercialized.
Yeah.
And getting the feedback of what would you need to actually commercialize this, which is not something that is taught in engineering school. Of course, that's another nice thing about MIT is that there are all these entrepreneurial courses that are taught in the Sloan School, right?
Yeah.
Taught by people who have started, in many cases, many companies, right?
Yeah.
That provide, I think, very helpful advice to the students.
Actually, that's an interesting note there, where I feel like a lot of the universities dream of the business school and the technical departments having some kind of synergy that leads to more spin-outs, where you're coupling up an MBA with a PhD and amazing, glorious things can happen. But I feel like it doesn't actually happen that often. Do you have a guess as to why that is? Because at least I would say that was my observation. I feel like both Sloan and the engineering departments really aspired to have a lot of these couplings occur, and they would keep trying to catalyze it, but I don't think that many would happen.
I did some happen. I saw some happen.
Okay.
So people, engineers that hooked up with friends from the business school and sort of in teams of 2 or 3.
Yeah. Okay.
Would start companies.
Yeah, because I sometimes felt like there seemed to be a little too much of a personality mismatch. It's like the engineering PhDs weren't the same personality type as the Sloanies. It was hard for them to get along.
I think that was very personal in terms of how people got along, right? And then actually, some of the engineering people did really well by essentially becoming business people. Like, so, there are people who have come out of chemical engineering and gone on to be directors at Goldman Sachs. Right?
What do you think are the skill sets that they developed during their PhD that still help them there versus, like you were also partially mentioning, what it takes to be successful on the startup side isn't really exactly what PhD selects for. But what do you think are the common threads?
MIT, I think what we really try to teach students to do is how to think and how to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the skill set you get from that, sort of the problem solving skill set.
Yeah.
And then, so instead of applying it to, a chemical problem, it'd be a financial problem, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of, especially in modern finance, a lot of that, the types of equations that you had to solve are not all that different.
Yeah.
Right. To kind of get an insight into what's actually going on here and what can I tweak to improve upon this thing.
Yeah. Because I think from my experience, in a way, the PhD was good about, like, you have open-ended problems and you just got to figure it out. Right. And in a way, that's very similar to startup, where it's a very open-ended thing.
Right.
As opposed to being in a very structured corporate environment where if you get plucked out of it and told to just go do something, you're like, wait, where's my instruction set? Who do I call to ask about this problem or that problem? They just got to figure it out on their own. When you've seen cases of, like, the academic background founders try to spin something out and it crashes and burns, what do you think were the most common reasons that would happen?
I don't think I've actually seen that close up.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
so it's very hard to answer that question. We
Right.
have seen ideas come up and then, lead to big spin-offs like molten metals, right, which for a while was very successful, died. And in some cases, there are lots of things that come up. Was it the leadership, or was it the timing, or was it because the funding at that period, there was just a critical need for investment that couldn't be fulfilled.
You've probably seen cases over the years where something spins out, whether it was from MIT or somewhere else, and you're like, that's a pretty stupid idea. But it spun out anyway. What do you think happens in those cases? Let's assume you were right about it being a stupid idea, but like, what do you think happens in those cases? That's something that, let's say, people like yourself who are in that zone and know that there's no way that's true, or there's no way this is going to work, but it happens anyway. Why do you think that happens, or how do those things happen?
Well, in some cases, it sort of happens because there's so much excitement about this field, right?
Yeah.
I was part of a DARPA program on portable power. There was so much excitement about this, and people provided all kinds of suggestions for how we could get to sort of more powerful power sources and batteries. And I remember at the first program meeting, I would say I and many others had concern not only about whether the second law was being violated, but whether the first law was being violated. Okay, and as the program went on, or at least we went away from violating thermodynamic laws, right?
Yeah.
It's something that one could have maybe had looked at from the beginning, right? And there were some startup companies that clearly were violating these sort of fundamental issues, right?
Yeah.
And in some cases, they got under control, and someone actually stepped in and said, "This isn't going to work, but let's think about what could work."
Yeah.
And then got out of it, actually came manageable things. Like,
yeah. Just like one more layer on those topics. So I'd imagine one end of it is whoever's championing this is a great storyteller, and that's part of why they can cause this excitement and make it happen. What do you think, let's say, their enablers, i.e. in this case, their investors, or if they have a corporate partner, or grants agencies miss? Because they must have people like yourself in their ears saying like, there's no way. And yet they still do it anyway.
Well, maybe they didn't get all the necessary advice. Right?
Yeah, that's fair. Good, because it is interesting when those things happen.
Because it's not perfect, right? You think you talk to all the right people in terms of the investment in this particular technology, right?
Right.
And maybe there are questions, and you believe the founders that's because they're not many of these questions are never clear cut, right?
Right.
So you give the founders the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I mean,
and find out later on that let's change that. Let's go back to something else. Yes.
Yeah. We talked a bit about the startups, but you've had a lot of experience from the academic side working with the pharmas or the other big companies. What are things that you think the bigger orgs are actually pretty good at and often don't necessarily get credit for it? Because it's easy to hate on the big organizations.
A lot of big companies are very good at, doing what they're supposed to do, right? And there are also big companies who are very innovative and good at bringing new innovations out, right? 3M used to have a sort of a mantra of 10% innovations every year, right? And they continue to be an innovative company for a number of years, right?
Yeah.
Corning is also an example of a well-established company that has moved into new areas, new investments, and so on. Pharma, I think does a good job of trying to really come up with new pharmaceuticals that will help people.
Yeah.
And making sure that they're safe and manufacturing them.
Yeah.
And they continue to innovate in how they've built these, the discovery platforms, as well as how to actually manufacturing and make the manufacturing better. And if you just even look today at pharma, how fast they have moved into AI and gotten it working in their discovery platforms and really using it and making advances, right? There are a lot
Yeah.
of other places where people argue whether AI is really contributing. I don't think there's anyone in pharma that will debate that it's actually cutting the development time.
And I guess related to that, especially for these more innovative big companies, what do you think it is that they're usually missing or they're strategically choosing to miss when they don't in-license new tech that looks interesting? And instead, that new tech has to become a startup if it's ever going to flourish, because these guys should get it, but either I don't know, they don't get it or they don't see it. What do you think is the miss there usually?
Very often the startup is willing to take risks that as a public company, a pharma company might not be willing to make.
Yeah.
There's just, a disease target that's outside the sort of standard disease target they're looking at, right? Or a biology that is unproven. Right? And so for them, this technique, they would have to take the technique and prove that the technology works, and then they apply it, right?
Yeah.
And they know, and I think that's true, that's not what they're best at.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't quite fit into sort of how they normally run their business, right?
Right.
It's much better to let it, so it's much better for them to fund a small company to try it out, right?
Right.
And if it works, well, they can always fight back, right?
Yeah. They'd rather have the lower risk, lower reward profile down the line. I feel like so much revolves around authorship of papers, who's first, who's last, et cetera. So it does have some individualistic incentives there because so much is tied to where you are on a paper. Whereas ultimately the kinds of things that'll make big movements in the, let's call it real world, are more team-oriented things. And I think often a contrast that PhD types immediately feel from going into, let's say, a startup environment versus academic is like, oh, it's so much more team-oriented than it was in the academic case. Are there things there that, I don't know, you think one could do better to encourage that teamwork early on? Or maybe you disagree with that premise altogether.
I really encourage people in my group to work together, and very, very often we had what I would call really teams, right? The latest work that we had on self-driving laboratories was a teamwork. There were a whole group of people, and it certainly in the people the work part of the work that was done in my lab was really driven by 3 people who worked very closely together. I think teamwork still is something that we try to encourage.
Yeah.
And I think this business of who's where in the paper has been blown out of proportion by, in many cases, the students themselves. It's true that it's important that you have something when you graduate that you can sort of point to is, well, this is what I did, right? Because it's the whole point of the PhD is learning how to do research or independent research. But on the other hand, it's not this counting game that I think the students imagine. I think a hiring committee sitting and counting. Some places maybe do that, but I don't think that places are really looking for talent. That's not the way to look at it.
Yeah.
Question of, what have we really managed to accomplish? And so it doesn't matter what does matter is that you can show that there's something where you played a key role, right? And then there are things that also counts, right? Where you were assisting, right? But that's also important.
Yeah.
Because you can be a team player, right? Because otherwise, if you're going to have a department run, everybody can't be prima donnas, then it doesn't work.
Related to some of those comments, kind of zooming it out and comparing different universities and institutions, what do you think are the most important things that some universities do, like let's say MIT, which is pretty good about having startup spinouts, versus University X that isn't good at it? What do you think are the pieces that are in place at somewhere like MIT that's other places don't have, either because they chose not to have it or didn't think to have it?
Well, it sort of goes back to what we talked about earlier. I think part of it is just sort of in the genetic makeup of the place.
Yeah.
So MIT has done this for a long time. And early on, in the early days when it sort of started, facilitated this by making rules and regulations. I mean, I think a lot of people on the outside think that MIT, you could do anything you wanted to, right? Well, we actually had very clear rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do, and
Yeah.
how student involvement should be handled, and so on. All these conflicts of interest rules,
Yeah.
which made it much clearer for people how to do it. And then, of course, then you have people that come, and because there were people that are successful and started companies, right? They're willing to, and they came back and helped other people start companies, right? It created a whole infrastructure.
Yeah.
And if you don't have an infrastructure of advisors and experience and so on, and a student that wants to do this and join up because they want to do it, you don't have the same ecosystem. And so some universities have that, but it's very hard to start that from bottom up.
How much do you think, let's say, location matters as far as proximity to the investors and proximity to the pharmas or other biotechs in the context of this? Because MIT, Harvard, they're in Boston, so conveniently it's a hub. Whereas if you just picked up MIT and put it somewhere very far away from the coasts, would it have had a much lower spin out rate?
I think that's an impossible question to answer, because it's sort of just it's also intertwined, right?
Yeah.
Because some companies moved here because students were educated here and so on. And I think you see the same thing in maybe at different scales in different parts of the country, right? But there are areas around academic institutions that have small startup companies or larger companies because they know there is a supply of talented young people that can work with them.
We've often come across people that might be from different regions, let's say Europe or US. They have cool tech, but they all feel like unless they move to Boston or San Francisco, they're just screwed. They're just never going to get enough money or talent to be able to do what they're going to do. But I agree. I could see it being a very intertwined, self-reinforcing network where because a certain critical mass of an ecosystem is there, it just begets more of the same in a good way,
right? But
also makes it super hard to recreate elsewhere. And how many biotechy startup centers does the world really need? Because from a scale perspective, why would you need 10 of them? Kind of in the home stretch, if you had your magic wand you could wave, what is one thing you would change about how academia interacts with startups that could make these transitions more likely to succeed, more of the right things going out, whatever your metric is? You could just change one thing.
I don't think I have a magic. I don't have a particular thing. I think that one could change to make it more successful or less successful. I'm sure there are things we could change to make it less successful, but I'm not sure what we should do to guarantee success.
Well, I don't know about guarantee, but make it more probable, or something you think that we do well that we have to make sure we keep doing because so much depends on that factor remaining true.
Well, so, the first thing is you have to bring in the talent.
Yeah.
Right. The second thing is you have to educate them well to really think about coming up with new ideas and being fundamental in how they approach this, and then understand the basics so that they don't repeat stuff because they didn't know that it existed, right?
Yeah.
And then, as I've mentioned several times before, is I think that encourage them to participate in the ecosystem, talk to other people who have done this. I mean, you wouldn't go in and operate a expensive piece of equipment trying to learn from another one how it actually works, right?
Yeah.
Same way if you're going to do, start a company, talk to people who have done it before.
Any trends you're seeing right now that make you optimistic or pessimistic about the future directions of science innovation?
Well, right now, I think we are in a really very difficult situation because of the lack of investments in science and technology and the lack of faith in science and technology.
Yeah.
And I see that being detrimental to everybody in terms of how things will move forward unless we change that.
Are there things you think we all could be doing to gain more popular, interest, respect, acknowledgement for the value of science?
And it's been said many times, and it's really difficult to do, but really communicate with the general populace of what we do, how we do it, and why it's important.
Yeah.
But not lecture to but engage the population and the outcome.
Part of the point of this interview series. Right. Making it more accessible. Are there any common misconceptions you think that occur for the general populace or students coming in about how academia works or what the role of professors and graduate student programs are? Because there's also a big disconnect between how many people do undergrad versus actually go to grad school.
Well, there's always been this misconception of the ivory tower, right? And there are people that think big thoughts and don't do anything or don't contribute anything. And then I think, and then you combine that with a lot of static about whether recently, right, about, is science doing the right thing? Are they actually, is it true what they're saying? And all this, because so many of these problems are complex.
Yeah.
And there are no simple answers. And yet, in many cases, public media and so on love simple answers, right? And so trying to tell people what people actually do, that they're not, that actually many of them scurry around. Academicians don't sit on top of some tower. They scurry around and do a lot of stuff and really try to both educate their students and also help the general public in terms of their inventions and findings.
Well, actually, that I think an interesting piece that I experienced, which was probably like the inverse of that, which was being in the ivory tower side, rightly or wrongly, and maybe this was just me, but I don't think it was just me, you develop this impression that we're doing the hard part of coming up with new stuff. And then some lower life form can go translate it and turn it into a product, go sell it. Because I think the idea of sales is just gag-inducing to a PhD. Or business stuff is for more lowly, MBAs to go do. We do only the kind of most elegant work of coming up with new things. But speaking for myself, part of the reason I jumped was I'm like, oh, there's so much between we came up with something and it's actually making a difference for people. And we have to jump out of this tower to do it. And it's not until you're outside that you're like, oh, wait, I was thinking about it all wrong.
I think that's only certain people that have those attitudes. I mean, you think about people who have actually recently won major awards, right? Mm-hmm. They've also been very entrepreneurial. They've started companies and so on, right? And then, so major scientific awards. So I think they're certainly fully aware of this. And academicians that think that way must be crazy because if they don't think they're selling when they write their grant proposals, I don't know what they do, right?
Yeah.
They're just selling to a very narrow audience of their peers, right?
Yeah.
But they're still selling.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree.
You're certainly convincing them that their ideas are the right ideas, right? And maybe it's too much to say that selling, but, it's still selling.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because I think that was one piece that, for me at least, and maybe it's just a phase that, let's say, the students and postdocs and maybe some early faculty go through, and then reality hits them in the face more later on as far as chasing all these grants and selling. But I think that was one interesting phenomenon that seems to happen at times. Any final reflections or comments, things that you're passionate about these days?
The last thing we talked about, I think it's really preserving, the wonderful, very exciting intellectual environment we have built, and making sure that persists.
Agree. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll do less sugar next time.